Hello, and welcome to another fully live Friday episode of Hacking with Friends. My name is Cody Kinsey. I am a security researcher at Varonis, and today we have, again, my special guest, Alex Lynn on.
Hi.
So you might have noticed we started a little bit late today, and that's because for some reason we cannot stream to YouTube. We don't know why, but it looks like it's not possible to currently do that. So anyway, if you are watching on one of our other platforms, yeah, sorry about that. But at least we're able to go live on all of our other platforms. And that is why it took us a little bit longer to get started today. So, all right, we have a lot of news to cover, and we've already lost about 15 minutes. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. I'm going to go ahead and start with some Apple-related news, which is really interesting. And I also have to give a shout out to Zam. Thank you very much for taking the initiative to send us some really great news that otherwise I might have missed and connect some of the dots that might not otherwise make a lot of sense. So first up is an urgent Apple iOS update to fix some actively exploited 0 days. And the groups that were behind exploiting these 0 days are the same people we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, which is the, this is the Pegasus NSO group surveillance platform. So this is something that often pops up in the news with 0 days when they find a way to weaponize some code and then end up making a tool that is used to target human rights defenders, journalists, all sorts of other people. So this is something that is expanding kind of fallout from all of this. It's something that we were kind of expecting because after a while, when you have something this big that uses as many ways to try to break into a system, there's going to be lots of things that need to be patched. So this is another round of patches from Apple that you should definitely make sure to apply. And you'll see that it's called the Force Entry, aka Megalodon.
Wow,
yeah,
it's intimidating.
Very serious. Yeah, so this was disclosed by researcher Illusion of Chaos. But they said that this was reported to Apple between March 10th and May 4th. So that was like a long time ago for the patch just to be coming out now for something that was actively exploited as part of like an advanced threat actor group. So yeah, this is a pretty big deal. But there's something interesting kind of at the end of this. They say that there's a massive backlog of vulnerabilities at Apple and that they often leave them unresolved for long periods of time and pay out less than other bug bounty groups. And sometimes bans researchers from the development programs just for reporting stuff. So obviously this is not like the most friendly environment for people to be reporting bugs in. And sometimes there are consequences for that. One of those consequences is, it took a very long time for this particular bug to be patched, which was being used by malicious actors and actively targeting the people who are buying Apple products and expecting those products to protect them. But this is a related story, but this is actually different flaws. 3 0-day vulnerabilities have been dropped that Apple just didn't fix, even though they were perfectly aware of them. And these had been disclosed through the standard kind of process. So this researcher who is going anonymously in this one had reported these bugs to Apple. And they were like, yeah, cool bugs. Yeah, this seems pretty serious. We'll get right on that. And we'll give you credit for it. And then they patched one of the bugs and they did not give them credit. So the researcher reached out and was like, hi, like that was hard to find. Like, I would really appreciate some sort of credit for the work that I did. They're like, oh yeah, sorry, we'll get you paid and we'll get you credit like later. There was some sort of like issue, but we're sorry for the inconvenience. So then they rolled out multiple security updates and none of them addressed these very serious issues that the researcher had found. So after getting frustrated and not getting credit for those issues, she eventually just dropped them. So the proof of concept code was published to GitHub. And these are mostly kind of like exploitation things where you're able to do stuff that you're not supposed to be able to do, which could lead you to be able to surveil someone or do some other stuff that's very sneaky. In particular, it's kind of weird how there is a lot of health data being stored on the iPhone, which is being transmitted potentially, off of the phone or being kept as part of the analytics. So when we're looking at the kind of stuff that these 0 days will do, it can get your Apple ID and full name associated with it. It can get some endpoint tokens. You can see file system read access, complete file system read access. Okay, well, that's not good. An address book database, including content, pictures, and metadata like creation, modification dates. So this is pretty bad. contains a list of contacts from mail, SMS. So this is not necessarily like full exploitation of the device or anything, but hey, at least it's something. So then we have allows any user installed app to determine whether any other app is installed on the device given its bundle ID. So this is something that typically you would get a prompt on your phone that would say, this app is trying to do this. Do you want to give it permission? But this 0-day allows you to completely bypass that and get permission anyway. We also have the any helper Wi-Fi info. So what this means basically is it could be able to get access to your Wi-Fi card, which would give it indirectly access to your location, because there's an API to figure out where you are, depending on what wireless networks you can see. So this is a very privacy kind of specific bug where it might not seem a big deal for it to be able to sniff wireless networks from your device. But if I was to create like a surveillance application that just was installed on your phone and sat there and would maliciously sniff Wi-Fi networks and tell me where you were, I would basically have installed a bug on your phone, and it would never have to go through the permissions check, and you would never be able to have the opportunity to deny it permission. So that's why some of these, like, they don't seem like a big deal, but you could use them to do a lot of bad things. And then the last one, it allows any user installed app to access analytics logs, such as medical information like the heart rate, count of detected arterial fibrillation, and irregular heart rhythm events. So if you're having heart issues, somebody could figure that out. Your menstrual cycle length, device usage information, screen time information, information about device accessories from the manufacturer model firmware. So any accessories you might have connected to your phone, application crashes with bundle IDs and execution codes, and language of web pages that users viewed in Safari. So this is
super invasive,
very invasive.
Wow.
Whether the user is logging sexual activity like that, it's first of all, why is Apple, like having this data be recorded as analytics that could be taken off the phone? Like that doesn't really seem like something that most people would be aware that all of these things were being logged and could be accessed by a third party. So yeah, the exploit code is confirmed to work on 10.15.0. So this is definitely something worth checking out if you are interested in some interesting 0 days that have just been released and so far not patched. So it's also, again, Zam has pointed out that these are two different things. These are not related to each other from the first story. So very, very interesting that, yeah, there's some of these backlog vulnerabilities. The consequences is the security researchers eventually get fed up and just drop them. And then we have an incident like this today. So pretty wild, and yeah, not exactly best practice to just release the proof of concept code on GitHub, but at a certain point, after a certain amount of time, this researcher pointed out that Google Project Zero discloses vulnerabilities in 90 days. And I've waited much longer. So at that point, like I might as well, well, I'm following the rules, I might as well release it. So yeah, so definitely something worth looking out for a patch for. Now, continuing on the trend of iPhones, we talked a while ago about those like Bluetooth beacons they were using to be able to locate lost devices and stuff, AirTags.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, it's like a inter-network thing between Apple devices that allows them to like communicate. I don't know over what protocol, but presumably Bluetooth.
Yeah, so it's like a Bluetooth beacon that allows you to find lost devices, and it consumes an incredibly low amount of power. And then the flip side of this is Apple has turned all of their phones into receivers for this. So they're constantly looking for these devices and making it so you can detect a particular device, even if it were maybe powered off. So it looks like this functionality has now come to some versions of the iPhone, meaning that it's possible to locate your phone and it will be broadcasting even after you shut it off. So that means there's basically no way, except for going in and changing maybe some of these settings. But by default, there's no real way to turn off your phone from sending any signals all the way.
Yikes.
You would need to dig into the the user settings and start disabling stuff in order to actually have your phone turn off when it turns off. So I get in like conversations with people about why iOS devices are not as popular with like hackers sometimes. And part of it is stuff like this. If you expect that your device is going to turn off when you turn it off, then you might be a little surprised to see Bluetooth signals coming out of it, especially if they're recognizable and can put you on a map.
Yeah.
So you might want to have your device be put on a map when it's powered off, or you very much might not. So this is a very interesting peek into things that can be turned into surveillance systems and platforms that most people may not even be aware are being enabled on their devices. If you are comfortable carrying around a beacon that will be logged by any other iPhone, no matter where you go, then cool. But if you want to disable this feature, so maybe all of your location data isn't like subpoenaable from random people being around you. Like just imagine if you had a subpoenaable record of all of your motions all throughout the day, anytime you walk anywhere near someone with an iPhone. Like that's kind of what we're talking about here. It's like traffic cams on steroids. So, you know, if you think about leaving breadcrumbs all over the place and having one company be responsible for knowing where you've been all the time, it's a little freaky to know that you need to go through some extra steps here in order to prevent yourself from being essentially tracked potentially as you just go about your daily business. And I know that the tracking on this works pretty, is pretty good. Like Zam was able to tell what flight we were on coming back from Los Angeles because we had an AirTag with us and he was able to see what individual runway we were on and what time we took off. So, you know, the potential for surveillance is very real on these sorts of platforms. And the fact that, you know, people are like, oh, scary, someone could stick an AirTag on my car. Well, like if your iPhone is basically an AirTag, then it means... you
have like a tracking device that's just always on you.
Yeah,
That's
well,
scary.
I mean, I guess you kind of already did, but
Right.
at this point, it's transitioned into a whole new thing where you can't even really turn it off and expect to not be tracked.
Yeah, I think it's not a new thing, but apparently like Bluetooth low energy is perpetually enabled on iPhones, like even if you turn them off. Like I think I've seen like a warjamming demonstration with this where even if the iPhone's completely powered off, it's still emitting like Bluetooth low energy emissions or something like that. And it can be used to like pinpoint stuff like your location or stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and the same is true with Wi-Fi. Assisted GPS still turns on the Wi-Fi card and uses it even if you turn that off. So you really have to turn off location services as well in order to prevent that from happening. So sometimes off doesn't really mean off. All right. So we talked about this a little bit last time, but can you explain the situation with ExpressVPN?
Yeah, so I think like 3 high-profile like people who work at ExpressVPN, I forget what their positions were, but I think even like the CEO was involved or something like that.
Yeah, another C-level executive. Yeah.
But they were like giving some sort of insider information to the UAE?
Not necessarily. So the story was, this is a company that's supposedly focused on like privacy, but some of the main dudes at this company were involved in creating a surveillance program for the United Arab Emirates and got in some trouble for that.
Ooh, scary.
So when people found out that, hey, these guys do not seem very ethical, like they seem like they're willing to just, you know, work as mercenaries, basically. How does that work ethic and attitude translate into their other business practices? And in this case, because ExpressVPN does market itself as a privacy-focused service for people who might have like interesting traffic, you can imagine that if no one was looking, then maybe somebody who was perfectly fine with selling data or working as a mercenary might try to find a way to make extra money, especially if they were involved in, I don't know, surveillance programs on a massive scale.
So conflicting interests.
Exactly. So the conflicting interests obviously have caused some issues at the company now where a lot of people who work there didn't understand that that was the situation. So there's continued fallout for this. And it's interesting to see that, you know, they're still dealing with the fallout of this from employees now who are requesting more information about, you know, whether or not these people were in charge of, you know, things at the company that might give them access to sensitive information, or whether the entire business model is based off of some elements that maybe they didn't totally understand. So if you're an ExpressVPN customer, then you might want to pay attention to the saga because it's interesting to know who created the company that you rely on, especially if it's for something like privacy. Although, again, I would say that you should not trust a VPN company with your privacy. It's just another company that can do whatever they want with it. So in this case, it's just one of those reminders that VPNs are not a silver bullet. You never know who's behind them. And in general, you know, it's not something that actually preserves your privacy overall. It's just something that prevents your internet service provider from seeing what you're doing and also prevents people on your local network from being able to look at your traffic or mess with it. So those are great advantages, but at the same time, there are still some problems.
Right.
All right. Next up, have you heard of BetterHelp?
No, I haven't.
So BetterHelp is one of those online services that tries to get you to, instead of go see a therapist in person or see we'll basically like either connect you or like try to use algorithms, and like they're trying to be like a very modern service. But the way that they're able to sell your data is actually really interesting. So there's lots of privacy regulation, like HIPAA, for example, in the United States that prevents healthcare providers from selling your information. For example, you can't go to the doctor and then have them turn around and be like, hey, Facebook, this guy is mega depressed. Like, you should hit this guy with some advertisements for stuff that depressed people love. That would not be legal. But and the same is true of insurance providers, but some of these third-party data processors or some of these third-party providers are not actually covered under this, and they can do whatever they want. So it's really interesting because while there's really strict rules for certain people, other people are totally allowed to do whatever they want. And this guy made a TikTok that got replied to by BetterHealth, and they were like, we would not do that. Refer to the privacy policy, and you will see what exactly it is we do. And when you refer to the privacy policy, it literally says we sell your data to marketers. We share our data. Well, it says we share your medical history data, like stuff like that, with our advertising partners. So if you are like a millennial and someone who likes, trendy online services, maybe like online banks and stuff, and you're trying to maybe try out another one of these things, you could end up basically letting, in your most private moments, like when you're vulnerable, letting advertisers basically know, like, you are more willing to buy certain kinds of stuff. And you may find yourself inundated with ads for certain things because you have mental health issues. And this gets into a corner of these sorts of businesses where often processing and selling data is a very, very, very good way for startups to get lots of investment. And if you look at their privacy policy and it says they can do it, they probably put that in there for a reason, because it's super profitable. If you can offer highly targeted advertising services, then that means you can make a ton of money, even if your original business model might not be that profitable. So maybe look at Facebook, for example. So really, some of these startups are presenting themselves as health services, but they're not bound by the same privacy laws. So I personally think this is pretty abhorrent, because when people go for help, they're lured in by promises of like this having a low barrier to entry, you can get started really quickly. People think that it meets the same standards as traditional health services. But because there's these loopholes, you really need to stop and take a look at the privacy policies for some of these things that are matching you with providers or whatever else, but they're not providers themselves. They're not insurance companies. They're still retaining data and they're still collecting it because they can. There's nothing specifically preventing them from having this data. And that, to me, is a big risk for people who might be in a vulnerable place and might not want to let every person who's trying to suck all the dollars out of them in their weakest moment know that. So, this also, as soon as the data is out there, you never know who's going to get it. Insurance companies could buy this data to know that maybe you have pre-existing conditions that are going to be expensive for them in the future. So it's just worth noting where your healthcare data goes and who is protected and who isn't. Most people don't even know how to spell HIPAA, let alone who it actually applies to. I'm dead serious. So for all the people you hear ranting about HIPAA and being upset about it, very few people actually understand that, like, while this law is very, very protective around certain people, like healthcare providers and insurance providers, it has absolutely no claim on most people unless you're in a very specific category. And once you start interacting in a health sense with a business that doesn't have those restrictions, you can almost guarantee that business will sell your data if it allows them to profit. And businesses like money. So just be careful of this sort of thing. This was one of those examples of a viral TikTok that actually brought attention to a really good problem. Some of these startups are not actually making money directly off of the things that they offer. They're making money off of processing data and by having lots of users. So keep that in mind when you're signing up for one of these trendy new services. All right, so this is also, we've had a lot of debate about the protections Apple was attempting to build into their phones. It would basically look for perceptually hashed images and then alert the authorities if they thought that you had something on your phone you weren't supposed to. And one of the arguments was, hey, what if a government says that you should do something that is not ethical, but they have a legal reason to do this? They're able to compel you through their legal process to do something, either through a secret court or whatever else. It's like, we will never, ever do that. So recently there was an election in Russia, and both Google and Apple removed apps from the opposing parties. because there was a legal process put in place and they wanted to keep making money in Russia. So that's the thing. Like, if you don't want to be kicked out of the country, you need to work with the government who's in power, and they can make things legal that compel you to do stuff that most people would say they would never ever do. So the reason why a lot of us were up in arms about this thing is in countries that are able to legally, abuse opposition or abuse the rules to suppress people, it really makes it simple for them to use these sorts of tools to further their goals and kind of change the original vision of what this is. And it's very hard to imagine a scenario in which Apple stops doing business with an entire country or multiple countries after they've built this sort of thing, when an official request comes in and they have a good cover story and it would cause more problems than it's worth to deny it. This is exactly the argument I was kind of making, is like, it's a very slippery slope when you build something that can rummage through someone's phone and call it end-to-end encrypted. Like, if your end-to-end encrypted involves rummaging before it gets to the user, then that is not, in my opinion, scanning for content and then looking through it. If that list of content you're scanning for can arbitrarily be added to, and the user has no idea, and it's not very transparent, then that to me means that that tool can easily be abused and the user would never know. So that's my issue.
And like their track record with vulnerabilities, as we talked about,
yes,
doesn't seem to paint them in the best light.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, so moving on. Oh, look at this.
Wow, that's awesome. Who did that?
That is made by my good friend Alex Lynn,
Oh,
who
crazy.
refused to listen to me and just get one of those remote release shutters and have the printer just physically hit it, which there's multiple guides on doing this on the internet.
It's literally way cooler.
Yes. Instead, Alex managed to make this work just through interacting with the Raspberry Pi and his, I'll just let you explain.
Yeah, so I used a really sketchy open source tool that allows you to do tethered shooting, which is basically controlling your camera like a DSLR completely over software. So that software is called Gphoto 2, but it actually doesn't support my current camera unless you have to compile all their sketchy undocumented software from scratch. So I spent a good 3 hours just trying to get tethered shooting working on my new Sony model camera. But basically, I edited the G code via Octoprint to trigger a custom script that will basically interact with this tethered shooting program. So every time a custom G code command is run, it'll assume a position, which is the head that's supposed to be staying stationary. And then it'll trigger that command to interact with the tethered shooting program to take a picture at every layer change.
So the idea is you've put in code into the print that makes it move to a certain position that should be the same position every time, so it should look still, and then also triggers the camera.
Yeah, so when it also sees a custom G-code command, which I think I have set to Octo 20 or something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It triggers a script on the Raspberry Pi, which calls Gphoto, which is a tethered shooting program. And then that interacts with my camera in order to take a picture at every layer change.
Yeah, so there's some really interesting guides on how to do these sorts of time lapses. You can see I also actually have a camera attached to the arm here, right there. But it takes pretty bad time lapses, and it does them kind of at random points. You can get it to make it a little bit better, but it's not a great camera. It's not in 4K. And this is. So being able to put together a 4K time lapse from really high resolution photos as it is built is super, super cool. This was the first one we did, so the lighting kind of coming from behind it. But some of the other ones we did where the lighting's a little bit more in front, you can see the texture really well. It's just an awesome way of doing a time lapse that's a little bit nicer than some of the other options out there. And if you don't have the patience to buy a shutter release and print a bracket for it and have the printer come over and whack the button every time it's ready.
This is completely free.
Yeah, this is completely free. Of course, it does rely on having a camera that supports, what was it?
I think it's the PTP protocol. It's something that allows you to do file transfer or control a camera over software. Gphoto 2 is working on releasing drivers or something like that allows you to interact with a lot of newer cameras. But I had to basically compile their new version completely from scratch, since the one I installed from apt doesn't support various new model cameras.
Yeah, and you did this with Octoprint, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, shout out to Gina at Octoprint. Hi. But also, this completely made it possible, and it was really awesome to be able to use a Raspberry Pi to make all of this possible. Because was this whole thing running on a Raspberry Pi?
Yeah, completely on a Raspberry Pi, just tethered over USB. And it's interesting because we might be doing a few videos on like how to get started with 3D printing or stuff like that. And this would provide really good B-roll footage for something like that.
And visual diagnostic for when something went horribly wrong.
Yeah.
So if you have a print that just keeps like stuff is going wrong and you need to see exactly when it fails and what happened, then this provides probably some of the best diagnostic data to figure out what's happening to your prints if you're really having issues. So probably not why you made it,
Right.
but still kind of a cool use for something that Alex worked on for like 2 days against my advice, but the end result was actually really cool. So I was wrong. I was just like, just wait for the thing to come in the mail. Also, I appreciate the challenge from ALFA Wireless. I have so many of their wireless networks adapters, and I guess somebody made a great comparison video of all their ALFA wireless adapters, and ALFA was like, wow, this guy has a lot of adapters, almost as many as one other person, and then me. So I'm just like, all right, Kimo Coder, aka Christian B, we're gonna square off when it comes to ALFA wireless network. But then again, they probably shipped him. They probably know how many they put in the box that went out to him. So this is probably a valid challenge. Well, when I go to Norway, we can compare ALFA wireless network adapters.
You gotta pull out the big guns. You have that huge
the parabolic grid.
That too.
I have multiple ones that look like batons or something you would like wave airplanes in with. They're great. Yeah, actually, thank you very much, ALFA, because we should do more stuff with ALFA wireless network adapters. We've been doing stuff with little microcontrollers, but for such a long time, I almost forgot how many cool things you can do with the real deal. All right, and also since we were talking about the things we're doing with microcontrollers, I just want to give a little update on the Wi-Fi Nugget project we've been working on. We got our hands on, and I'm sorry, Zam, I know you're very, very jealous. We got our hands on these ESP32S2 minis. So these are pin compatible with the D1 Mini, so they're really small, and they happen to just fit in the Wi-Fi Nugget. They run CircuitPython, MicroPython, not so good with Arduino yet with the ESP32S2, but they're able to mount themselves as a USB drive. So I was showing Alex this today. You basically put a bootloader on it. You then install CircuitPython by dragging and dropping it on the board, and then you can execute Python code by just opening Mu Editor and saving the changes to the board as a USB drive, and it automatically just updates and runs as you make changes. It's
pretty great.
Super cool and easy compared to all the bit banging nonsense that happens with MicroPython on like the ESP8266. So I actually love these things. They're super cool. Unfortunately, you can't buy them now because we bought like the last ones. I don't know why they only made like 100 of them, but we bought like 80, and then some other lucky person bought the other 20. So hopefully we can get our hands on more of these, and hopefully they're released so everybody else can buy them too. But it was super cool to run CircuitPython on these and see all the advantages of having this mount as a USB drive. Adafruit does an amazing job with their user experience for these sorts of things once you find the right code, because there are some examples that don't work. But I actually made a Hack 5 video on getting set up with CircuitPython. So if you want to try it out, then stay tuned to Hack 5, and it should be coming out. We'll see when. All right, back to the regular news. Actually, Alex, you've got some stuff.
Do I? Let's
you
see
sure
what
do.
I have. I saw a pretty interesting one on, let's see if I can pull it up here. So there's an interesting Chrome exploit with a new HTML tag type. If you could switch over to my screen real quick. Yeah, so the old iframe protocol that allows you to basically embed content on HTML pages, Chrome is trying to replace that with something new, I believe, called portals that gives you a new layer of interactivity with embedded HTML content. But apparently there was an exploit in this that allows memory to be exploited, a use after free exploit in particular. But basically, arbitrary code can be executed on computers running unpatched versions of Chrome that are using portals and like specific web pages. And this is pretty interesting because they also have a ton of other zero-day vulnerabilities that were worked on this year. So this is a pretty interesting new one to see.
Yeah, Chrome seems to be a pretty big target. I remember there was that nation state attack where basically Chrome exploits were used in order to go after security researchers who were like lured into like a fake security blog. It was really interesting. So Chrome is definitely a big attack surface.
Yeah.
All right, so I have one. This one is near and dear to Zam's heart. So Windows 11 is no longer compatible with Oracle VirtualBox virtualization.
Interesting.
That's a big deal because lots of people run VirtualBox. And
so you just can't run it on Windows 11?
Right. So there's a couple caveats to this. Well, no, rather, you can't run Windows 11 in VirtualBox.
Oh, weird.
Yeah, so the reason for this is Microsoft now is going to require certain new system requirements to install the operating system. And previously, they did not check this when they were allowing it to be installed on a virtual machine. So, and they said, we're not going to check for compatible hardware when installed or upgraded. Great. But then they did an about face. And lots of people are pretty upset about this. Because now they have to figure out what to do about this, because basically they're mandating that this has certain security features in order to mitigate some pretty nasty security vulnerabilities that came up around like 2018 or so. So that's why they're kind of creating a cutoff here for what is acceptable. It needs to have certain security features, like if you don't have TMP support or use a small small system disk, sorry, they get this, which just says currently doesn't meet Windows 11 system requirements. So yeah, if you don't have secure boot, if you don't have TMP, or rather if your virtualization system doesn't add that, then it just won't run. So it's also not a problem for some different types of virtualization users, like VMware, Hyper-V, Parallels, and whatever that is. Yeah, because they have TMP pass-through and secure boot. So that's not going to be an issue if you're doing that. But because so many people use VirtualBox, they kind of dropped the ball on this, and they made it so that it's just not really possible. So there's still ways of like doing it where you can do like a pass-through and use the host's TMP. So like if your computer supports these requirements, then VirtualBox will just like pass it out to that in order to kind of like patch this. But it's still a really important requirement, because going forward, they want to mitigate things, some of the things with like Spectre and Meltdown that could apply without the right mitigations. So for virtualization, they're mandating this in order to make sure that I guess they don't get a bad name for Windows being insecure for some of these things that have been known for quite some time. So yeah, Zam, thank you for pointing this one out. A very, very interesting story, because again, people are just kind of upset about this, and it seems like just like a vendor quarrel kind of thing where like a lot of people are like, why are you changing this? But it's really like Microsoft has decided to draw kind of a line with how vulnerable they're willing to have their system be versus how backwards compatible they want it to be with existing platforms. So interesting story. So another interesting story is some cryptocurrency exchanges getting sanctioned. So getting sanctioned sucks, especially if you have money, because the US government will typically just take it away from you and then maybe prosecute you for crimes. So this is Sux, and it's registered in the Czech Republic, but they actually don't have any physical presence there. It's kind of like a Russian exchange. And pursuant to Executive Order 13694, they're in trouble. So they've received about $160 million in Bitcoin from illicit and high-risk sources. And you can see this is not all the same stuff. You can see 12 million from ransomware, 24 million from just random scams, over $82 million from high-risk exchanges. I don't know what exactly that means.
It's pretty ambiguous.
Gambling, maybe? P2P, mini, Merc, hosted, high-risk. Over 20 million from darknet markets, and over $24 million from mixers. What are mixers?
No clue.
Bitcoin mixers? Tumblers?
I'm not familiar.
Okay, so typically when criminals want to hide money, they'll use what's called a Bitcoin tumbler in order to put a bunch of money into a pot with a bunch of other people, mix it all up so you're not having the same Bitcoin, and then at the end, you get a random Bitcoin with a random history. And if the pool is large enough, and if they mix it up enough times, it becomes really difficult to know who is walking away with what money.
Sneaky.
Yeah, it's very sneaky. So operating basically kind of like a money laundering service will get you in trouble because it helps anonymize or wash like illegitimate money. So this is something that people who are accepting ransoms will frequently do. You have no idea like who's trying to like wash this money. And in this case, it looks like the exchange didn't really care because $24 million flowed through it. So yeah, that's a lot of money in illicit stuff. Although I will say $82 million in just high risk exchanges. I do need more explanation about that. That just seems like you just pick stuff that you don't like gambling. Like, okay. Anyway, so this is part of a bigger effort to go after ransomware gangs by disrupting their infrastructure. Obviously, there was some other stuff. They just like drove over to Coinbase and they were like, hey, give us this money. And Coinbase was like, well, you're the FBI, and just did it. So other ransomware groups have been disrupted using the exchanges that they favor. So this is kind of a weak point. They need to have infrastructure capable of moving money. And if the US government is willing to hit them quickly and hard, then it will eventually probably become the case that exchanges don't want to get hit by the US government for something that's preventable. unless their business is primarily doing sketchy stuff, in which case they just make themselves a prime target. Okay, and then let's talk about farmers. So we've got Black Matter ransomware that's after a farm group. So this is a cooperative farm group. It's a farmers feed and grain cooperative with over 60 locations throughout Iowa. And this is actually an interesting story because this group had pledged not to go after critical infrastructure, mostly so they didn't get nailed by the U.S. government. They didn't want to go after anything like the pipeline because that caused way more attention than they wanted. And at that point, the U.S. government has to do something. Otherwise, people are just going to be really mad. So it's really not good to force them into a position by going after critical infrastructure. And everybody likes to eat. So it kind of seems like this one is against the rules, you might think, because attacking this target just means you're going after a food business that's critical to people being alive. And you might think that maybe the United States government's going to get mad about that. Apparently, Black Matter ransomware attack operators do not agree with this. So there's been an exchange kind of back and forth saying why did you attack us? We make food. What do you this is going to affect food. You're going to get in way more trouble than this is worth. And the threat actors are just yeah, no, just pay us. If you don't pay us, we're going to make it more expensive. So
did they end up getting the payout? Or?
No. So at this point, it's kind of funny because this company's this is against the rules, we're calling the cops. But it was already, it was already against the rules.
Right.
So now, the police are involved and this is a known thing. They obviously didn't keep this one under the rug. They might, and who knows if they're going to end up paying or not, or if the U.S. government's going to get involved. But, it's hard to do much about math. When your stuff is encrypted with strong randomness, it's very hard to get it back unless you get the key. So it's apparently also what's called a dual exploitation attack, where over 1,000 gigabytes of data have also been stolen, and that's part of the ransom, where they're saying if you don't, then we have your data, you don't, and everybody else is going to have it too, or at least the most embarrassing parts if you do not pay us. So that is again, critical infrastructure. You're not supposed to see that be hit if these ransomware groups don't want a whole lot of trouble, but it seems like this group doesn't care. So it's very likely we see news in the immediate future of the U.S. government getting involved and really going after this group as a result of them going after critical infrastructure again, because it really governments are expected to protect their critical infrastructure no matter what. So an attack like this makes the U.S. look like it doesn't have its stuff together, and you can guarantee that there's going to be some sort of response if it keeps interfering with things that affect people's food, for example. All right, Alex, you got another one?
Let me see if I do. Okay, this is a pretty interesting one. So apparently some sort of authentication feature with email clients through Microsoft Exchange and Outlook. So apparently when you try to authenticate using your login credentials, like your username and password, Microsoft tries to send this to some Autodiscover URL type thing. But there's an exploit where a security researcher was able to register his own Autodiscover domains, and credentials were trying to be validated against that and sent to this domain, where you could basically see a whole bunch of different login credentials for people just trying to log into their email like regular people. But Microsoft's response to this was to try to register all of the various spin-offs of Autodiscover domains that they could before someone else hopped onto this.
So kind of basically a sinkhole, basically.
Yeah.
So they just grabbed all the things that could be used maliciously and just sunk them to nothing.
Right, but it's pretty interesting to see such a trivial exploit, just having access to these domains.
That's so funny.
Yeah, it's
like having a catch-all domain, a catch-all email account on a domain that's one letter away from Gmail or something like that.
Right.
Because you constantly just get emails that are supposed to go to other people, but they just misspelled something. So if you just had a catch-all email for something very close to Gmail or whatever, every time someone misspelled Gmail, you would just get that email that was supposed to go to someone else. Right. So it's just a funny way of going about that sort of attack, but it does work. All right, so let's talk about we're not done with Apple. Let's go ahead and switch back to mine. And there's a relay service that's supposed to, on iCloud anyway, protect people from having their IP address exposed. So you can kind of think of this as a really simple version of Tor. It basically goes through two proxies, and it's supposed to make it so the end result isn't going to give away your relative location from something like a canary token if you happen to click on one. The idea is kind of cool. It's like having a built-in VPN sort of, but not really. It's more of just a proxy. And the problem here also is that not everything is proxied the same way. So WebRTC is something that it has just been a problem for a lot of privacy-focused initiatives because it doesn't seem to play by the same rules. And I've seen this on things like Grabify and other sorts of trackers where they use WebRTC for all sorts of things that you would not expect a website to have access to, like the orientation of your phone or the charge level of your phone or the specific GPU your MacBook Pro is using. All these things can be accessed by WebRTC. So unsurprisingly, this web real-time communication protocol is also just forwarding the real IP address of the user. So because this is enabled, it means that this fancy proxy service can actually just be kind of peeled back relatively simply because not everything is being put through the proxy in the same way. And some of the original data is still making it through to the other side. So anybody that's using this and expecting it to keep them private should probably be aware of the fact that, yeah, it doesn't actually do that. There are some flaws that currently make it so that it doesn't actually hide your IP address. It just does a best effort at doing it from some sources. And you better believe that if advertisers have access to tools like Grabify, they're definitely going to be trying to grab around and find information if they're aware of this new change. So I would imagine that this is definitely being used by people to be able to get around this sort of new privacy feature. All right, so we also have Netgear. We talked a bit about a different vendor that was having issues with a fork of the Mirai botnet. This is something that seems like they managed to get away with not being hit by anything yet, but it was a remote code execution vulnerability where you could basically trigger this relatively simply and modify network traffic or start intercepting traffic or even gain a remote command injection as root on the targeted router, which is obviously pretty bad. But the thought of this was if you went after an internet service provider and then from there, you were able to connect to and compromise routers connected to the Circle Parent Control Service vulnerability, then you would be able to use those compromised routers as a beachhead to go after all sorts of different organizations. So basically, you could compromise one service provider and then downstream go after lots of different people and start doing malicious stuff. Some of them probably with pretty juicy stuff. So if you're going after a specific person, you could just hit their internet service provider instead, and that would give you a way of breaking into one of their customers. Pretty spooky. These supply chain attacks are like an easy way for people to bypass otherwise secure environments, because if your router is part of a management group and you can push out changes from an internet service provider, it means that the internet service provider might be the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to a way in to the company.
In the same vein, it looks like there's a pretty significant vulnerability in the Cisco iOS system, which is the operating system. Yeah. Which is an operating system that runs on a lot of devices, maybe perhaps even Netgear things. But I think this is a remote execution vulnerability that affects like a ton of high-profile Cisco devices. But yeah, it's pretty scary because it looks like, where's the ratings for this? There's a few that were like 10 out of 10 on the...
That's not good.
Yeah, it's
10 out of 10 security vulnerability means that
right.
But
yeah, this is affecting a lot of
the system.
Super high profile devices that are obviously being used for things like internet switching, stuff like that.
All right, so almost out of time, but one thing I wanted to mention that kind of blew my mind today, if we switch back to my screen, is this vulnerability in Windows that lets hackers install Rootkit. So what is this? So basically, if companies want to prevent employees or really anybody from stealing a laptop and just erasing the operating system and having all the monitoring software gone, there's an option in Windows to basically have a signed binary sit there and then just be reloaded as soon as the new operating system is put in. So you can have this monitoring binary that's reporting, back to some like anti-theft server and monitor someone who's walked away with the laptop, even if they manage to overwrite everything else. So the problem is that you can use an expired or revoked certificate to load your own binary. And then you've basically just got this secret little mechanism to keep persistently loading what could be a rootkit or malware onto someone's version of Windows.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting attack because like this is something that's really malicious, but it's actually working exactly as designed. It just has a little problem with checking to see if it's like your employer's malware or an attacker's malware. So super, super interesting for just a feature to have kind of run wild. But you should definitely check this out if you're curious about the way that some of these features for Windows can actually be used by attackers to break in and establish a persistence that's very difficult to detect. And most people might not even be aware is a feature on their Windows system. And then last is scanning. So lots of scanning for a particular vulnerability. What does that mean, Alex? If you see lots of scans for a particular CVE?
That means people are probably trying to exploit something that's like a pretty active and scary vulnerability.
Exactly. So right now we have internet exposed VMware vCenters can basically have a arbitrary file uploaded to them. So if the internal configuration is to maybe run that file, then it would be easy for an attacker to overwrite something that's critical, add something that maybe shouldn't be running, and otherwise affect the environment. So this isn't quite as bad as, like the ability to just automatically break your way in, but it is pretty bad because if you figure out something that will, let you in through a different method, you can now add a file to the file system that should not be there, or even potentially replace a file that is running or has permission to run. So as soon as a patch was released, the scanning immediately started, and lots of people started looking for this. You can also see there's a kind of a heat map of like the different places that we're scanning. It's kind of funny because you see like all these like threat actor places, and then also like obviously the United States, but then like a bunch of companies in the US that do like, I guess like scanning for figuring out like where vulnerabilities are and threat mapping and stuff. So some of these are like threat actors, and other of them are probably companies doing things that are very similar to threat actors. It's kind of hard to tell who's who sometimes. Right. But this is just a warning to people who have the VMware vCenters up on the internet and haven't been patched, because this is something that you can discover and exploit remotely. So you better believe that they are going to create tools that automate this process and allow them to target and exploit lots of different devices all at the same time. So be aware, there are lots of people who are interested in this now that proof of concepts are out there. Proof of concepts make it a lot easier and really knock down the skill level necessary to take advantage of some of these exploits. So yeah, just make sure you patch and watch out for these sorts of attacks. All right, so that is all we have time for today. We lost a little bit of time in the beginning because of technical issues, but we will save this and re-upload it to YouTube later. So if you're watching on YouTube, hi, sorry we weren't able to go live, but we appreciate everyone in the chat. And of course, thank you again to Zam for sending in a bunch of these security issues and also giving a little context to them, because especially some of the Windows ones were really interesting. That's all we have for this episode. Alex, thank you very much for joining us.
Of course, it's always great to be here.
Everybody have a good weekend, and we'll see you next time. Bye.